The new trailer for Resident Evil has sparked an interesting conversation. Should video game movies be perfect adaptations, be perfectly accurate to their games? Sonic the Hedgehog and his trilogy of films have kind of spoiled us a little bit with how games are adapted nowadays. The characters, the scenes, the moment-to-moment action, it's replicated almost exactly on screen. For most of our history, though, as video game fans, though, these adaptations have taken liberties. And many of these liberties...
Beautiful 180, crazy, if you wanna believe that anything could stop. She's really good.
Have sucked. No one forgets Super Mario Bros. Being a weird cyberpunk story about mold growing through buildings. No one forgets the choices made with Street Fighter, some of which are very popular. And very few people forget the Milla Jovovich Resident Evil series.
My name is Alice.
Shut the fuck up!
Nowhere was that idea of taking liberties more true than with Resident Evil. To this day, Resident Evil is one of the most profitable video game movie franchises of all time, despite most people just outright hating the movies. Yeah, they made a lot of money, increasingly so as time went on. For low-budget films, they were probably the most profitable of all these movies. Arguably more profitable than Sonic. But not for long! But a lot of this had to do with the superficial way the Resident Evil movies adapted the games. Characters are transformed into skin-deep caricatures. The films sacrifice horror for bland action. Very stereotypical Matrix-inspired action. If you show me a shot from Resident Evil and a shot from Underworld, I couldn't tell you the difference unless I saw a zombie. The main protagonist of these films is the game-breakingly powerful Alice, played by Milla Jovovich. Someone who gains psychic powers, absurd super strength, regenerative powers, and even after the third film, an entire clone army that's so ridiculously powerful, they kill them all off in the next movie. While game characters do show up in these films, Alice outshines them. Every single time, invariably. When they're about to do something cool, Alice steps in to do it for them. They seem weak by comparison, and thus it breaks the tension. When watching these films, we know Alice will beat Umbrella. We know Alice will stop the T-Virus. The game characters we love, they might just show up. They might be in the background for a few shots, but they won't play a big role. Also, Umbrella in these movies is kind of stupid. You see, the thing is with the games, Umbrella is this great, powerful company, but things kind of unravel due to egos and just waste piling up and a giant slug army underneath the Spencer Mansion. That's a thing that happens. It's kind of crazy. Like in the original games, the virus breaks containment because Umbrella or Tricell or the Connection later on, though I think that's like after the movie's wrapped up. They're trying to see what capabilities in combat Mr. X or Nemesis have, or things just spiral out of control as they try to pursue their goals to advance human evolution. Albert Wesker, for example, is the product of a eugenics program. But in the movies, what does Umbrella really want? Yeah, they explain it, but the explanation is kind of incoherent, kind of sloppy, and it doesn't really stick with you because it's really just an excuse to get to the next action set piece. Umbrella is the evil organization behind everything in these films, and you just don't give a shit. And you don't give a shit because the movies are about flashy fights involving monsters. But they make little sense. Elements from Resident Evil 4 and 5 get mixed in inorganically, despite them never introducing Las Plagas, the parasites from that little village in Spain that Wesker appropriates and experiments on. They don't make any sense with a T-Virus story. So we need a new film, a new series to kick things off again. The new trailer for Zach Cregger's Resident Evil appears to use the games as a blueprint, the foundation upon which they can build. Don't expect Leon, Chris, Jill, or even Wesker. Zach Cregger is a filmmaker I trust to deliver something that captures the feelings of Resident Evil quite well. But is that enough? I don't know yet. We need to see more of the film. We have a teaser to work with, and it doesn't even fit in perfectly with what the games do, but is that necessary? However, I can tell you this. Slavish devotion to the original series might not be the right path forward either. No matter what complaints you might have, we've done that already. To prove my point on this, I want to open your eyes up to the forgotten Resident Evil film. 2021's Welcome to Raccoon City. Yeah, I bet you forgot this game even existed. Welcome to Raccoon City decided to adapt the first two Resident Evil games into one fast-paced film. On one hand, it's not a total failure, but it has a substantial number of problems that I think make it bad. It feels geared less to tell a story and more geared to just introduce cool things from the games that fans want to see in live action. like a fan film. As a result, the story feels extremely weak. The conflict is geared to guide characters from one set piece to another, and it's all very predictable and very formulaic. It doesn't really develop the characters all that well because it's shoving too many characters from too many games into one space. I'm already very sorry, Leon Kennedy fans and Jill Valentine fans. You guys got screwed with this movie. The movie opens with a group of characters under the care of Dr. Birkin. In the original games, William Birkin was one of the main researchers for Umbrella. He develops the Golgotha virus from experimenting on the imprisoned Lisa Trevor. He is partially accountable for the Raccoon City incident because the bio-waste produced by his various experiments in his underground lab, The Nest, situated right underneath Raccoon City itself, produces a lot of bio-waste. And that bio-waste that contains the T-virus is dumped into the sewers. It mutates and infects the rats, infects the drinking water, and in turn infects the town. In the original games, Lisa Trevor is kept under the Spencer Mansion in the labyrinthian tunnels that her father built for Oswald Spencer. But here, she's under Raccoon City, and we're introduced to her when we reach into the Raccoon City orphanage, which is run by Umbrella, and makes contact with a young girl under Birkin's care. Specifically, Lisa Trevor reaches out to Claire Redfield. She and her brother Chris are under Birkin's care and tutelage. We later realize that there's an implication these kids are kept here as part of Umbrella's studies and examination, looking for candidates to test the T-virus on. This is all communicated to us through the most direct, sloppy means possible, though. The focus is on telling the audience these characters have names that we recognize rather than immersing us into a scene, or making us care about who these characters even are in the first place.
Dr. Birkin.
Lisa Trevor?
Redfield, isn't it? Chris and Claire Redfield? You're a good boy for taking such care of your sister.
Shut the fuck up! Also, does Birkin just let Lisa Trevor just wander around an orphanage? Like, what's up with that? In the games, again, she's trapped under the Spencer Mansion, which is like labyrinths and tunnels and traps meant to keep you locked in place. It's not meant to just allow you to just walk out freely. We later find out that she is kind of trapped under Spencer Mansion, but we'll get that in just a second. We then fast forward to 1998, and trust me, this movie makes you aware it's the 90s. Claire Redfield is going back to Raccoon City to reunite with her brother Chris. And there's this truck driver she hitches a ride with, and they plow over a zombie.
Where'd you learn to walk? Cripple school? Nice!
We learn that Umbrella has abandoned Raccoon City, which has basically resulted in all the industry in town to kind of decay. Raccoon City is a town in decline, but all this is told to us via exposition. There's very little visually that we see that tells us Raccoon City is a particularly underprivileged or rough city to live in. But what about Chris? Well, in the games, Chris at this point is investigating Umbrella because Resident Evil 1 happened before Resident Evil 2. I know, controversial. But here, Chris, Jill, and Wesker, as well as Leon Kennedy, are all cops in Raccoon City. Not stars, the RPD specifically. And Jill's making like Jill sandwich jokes with nice guy Albert Wesker.
Hey! You snooze, you lose. What? It's Jill sandwich now.
Yeah, nice guy Albert Wesker. At this point, I'm kind of thinking, okay, Wesker's such a friendly guy, he's so charming, it makes sense why he gained the trust of his peers and how he betrayed them later on. Because Wesker is, of course, one of the most famous traitors in video game history. Well, hold that thought. Put that in your back of the mind for a second, because we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that, don't worry. Anyway, a few cops are going up to the Spencer Mansion, which is outside of Raccoon City, to investigate a body that was found there. These characters kind of disappear for the movie for a bit, but that's essentially the Bravo team from Resident Evil 0. Notice how every character, when being introduced, by the way, says their whole name.
Jill Valentine.
Leon Kennedy.
Oswald Spencer was the creator of the Umbrella Corporation.
It's meant to reinforce there's someone you should notice. Anyway, the whole city's becoming slowly infected because the T-virus has spread everywhere. But no one's actually doing anything about it. People show signs of infection, like tears of blood coming down their faces, and this kind of like, yeah, that's probably nothing. That's probably nothing at all. In the games, the hospitals were overflowing with just bombarded the town's infrastructure until everything collapsed. When Claire and Leon enter Raccoon City, the town is already in collapse. See, one theme in the original Resident Evil that's brought up here as well is that Umbrella only operates the way it does because local and government officials turn a blind eye to it. They're all paid off, as seen specifically with Brian Irons, the police chief of Raccoon City. Everyone is in on what Umbrella's doing at the higher level, but they find it to be more profitable to work with the company rather than oppose it. And characters like Irons realize all too late that once you've outlived your usefulness, Umbrella has no value for you. As the virus slowly gets out of control, however, Claire comes looking for her brother, finding him in his home. And we get a weird amount of exposition describing a love triangle between Chris, Jill, and Wesker that plays no role in the story and never comes up in character interactions outside of exposition, and kind of makes me wonder why we're even mentioning this, because it has no role in the story, but I digress. Who fucking knows? It's meant to build character development. Unfortunately, the thing with exposition is, when a character's trait is described, it usually helps reinforce it if the characters act on those traits. Unfortunately, Jill has almost no lines of dialogue in this whole movie, and thus any love triangle involving Jill falls flat because she's not given enough to do. Because we're combining two games together. Maybe it was a bad idea to take Resident Evil 1 and combine it with Resident Evil 2. I don't know. Call it a crazy idea. Maybe they deserved separate movies. That was the original idea that George Romero had for the first Resident Evil movie that he wrote a script for. Just take the Spencer Mansion and tell that story straight through. It's a perfect zombie story structure. Isolated, you're stuck in one location. You don't have to build a lot of sets. But no, in the infinite wisdom they had for this film, they decided to take two completely separate games with separate tones, structures, and styles, and mash them together. Sure. Anyway, Claire and Chris. We learned that Umbrella has essentially poisoned the water supply, like in the games. Umbrella here, I feel, is a little bit more realistic than in the prior Resident Evil movies with like this evil organization that runs everything. The T-virus leaks because of the very gradual process of things just going bad. That it all goes wrong at once feels a little unreasonable, but it makes sense. But Claire and Chris only talk about this external conflict, or people pertaining to Umbrella like Birkin, who Chris refers to as like a father figure. The chemistry between Chris and Claire is weak because you don't get a sense of who they are as people outside the functionality they serve to the plot. It's all tell, don't show, outside of the truck scene, which is like the games, where we see the things happening. At this point, it's been a half hour of just people telling us who they are, as opposed to people showing us who they are. Now, we start realizing things are getting a little more drastic when William Birkin gets a call in the middle of the night and moves his wife and daughter, his daughter being Sherry Birkin, out of town. It's a little different here because Birkin is still himself at this point. In the games, before things really kick off, Birkin is shot and infects himself with the G-virus because he's a liability to the company. He's backstabbing them. He's trying to deal under the table. The first half hour of this film, though, doesn't do anything to establish personal conflicts, just external conflicts, just expositional conflicts. And as a result, we don't care about these characters. We don't care about them outside the names we recognize. Umbrella is barely a presence in the plot despite running the town, because they're rarely depicted as a company in the story, at least in this first half hour. It also doesn't help that the infected are dumb stereotypes being creepy, and that no one reacts like they would if they saw a zombie in front of them. Like look right here. Claire reacts to the first infected she finds outside the car crash, and it should be nightmare fuel, what she's seeing, and she reacts like this.
Hey, you need help?
Excuse me, what the actual fuck you do?
Also, Wesker doesn't wear sunglasses. We have to wait to the very last scene of the movie for Wesker to put on his sunglasses. We need an origin story for his sunglasses.
You shitting me?
Also, did you miss the part where I mentioned that Sherry Birkin, major Resident Evil character Sherry Birkin, is basically a background character in this movie who's mentioned very briefly and shown extremely briefly? You might have even forgotten, if you haven't played Resident Evil 2 in a while, that Sherry Birkin is even a character here, despite her being the daughter of the big villain and a reoccurring protagonist throughout the series. Seems kind of like a big oversight for the Raccoon City story to neglect Sherry Birkin, but what are you gonna do? But then again, I guess it could be worse. She could be Leon Kennedy. We then get a big exposition scene with Brian Irons, who doesn't seem to know what's going on, but we know he actually does, where he can verbally abuse Leon Kennedy. Again.
I didn't mean you, you moron. Not you, Leon, everyone else.
By the way, quick question. Do you remember this movie takes place in the 90s? Don't worry, Brian Irons is here to remind you this takes place in the 90s.
Maybe you could take her out to eat at Planet Hollywood. They have a new one in Catlin. Just take her back to your apartment. Rent a movie at Blockbuster, get cozy on the couch, or put on some drink. Steve Perry's voice, what it does to a woman's heart.
I hate that Brian Irons is the most developed character in the entire movie because he has a personality. Anyway, Chris, Jill, and Wesker are sent to investigate Bravo team at the Spencer Mansion, while Wesker is given cryptic hints that Raccoon City is set to be destroyed in the morning. We later find out in a post-credit scene the person telling him this is Ada Wong, which means Ada Wong, who famously works for Wesker in the games, is now Wesker's employer in the films. That's weird, right? Isn't that a little weird? Also, spoiler alert, Albert Wesker does not actually work for Umbrella in this movie, and he's not the product of eugenics in the Wesker program like he is in the games. Meaning that Albert Wesker bears almost nothing in common with the game version of Albert Wesker. He doesn't even have his fucking sunglasses, man! That's iconic! Anyway, this whole time, William Birkin is rushing to preserve his work before the town is destroyed, that work specifically being the G-Virus. And look, can I just emphasize right now how all the problems in this movie, with all these components rushing at each other, all these characters in different directions, they only are happening because the film forces too many subplots into one space. Resident Evil 1 and 2 are not complicated games, in terms of stories anyway, but there's a lot of elements communicated wisely through found documentation that fills us in on what's happening in a relevant fashion. We learn specific information like let's say like how the Spencer Mansion was built, about Lisa Trevor, about the nest, through specific, focused information. But also the games showcase raw experiences. They dump you into an active disaster zone, and you gotta pick the pieces up as you go. The movie would work just better if it was just an adaptation of one or two rather than both. Sherry Birkins is a major character of Resident Evil 2, and she has maybe 3 lines in the whole movie. Even William Birkin, the big bad of this film, disappears for long stretches of time. And Leon Kennedy is, well, look at him. Look what they did to my poor boy. The first half hour of this film is more interested in layering lore than it is in justifying the story itself. Though to the film's credit, it's more effective to have Umbrella be the system of order and control that struggles to hide their screw-ups, rather than whatever it becomes in the original Resident Evil films. And when Umbrella does showcase violence to keep people inside Raccoon City, it is effective and it is disturbing. But again, is this a movie about characters or locations? The sets are lovingly constructed and remarkably empty. Like, yeah, it's night, but there's so many empty streets and so many empty buildings. I know they're infected. I know it's been depopulated because of poverty, but Raccoon City seems strangely empty when you leave the couple of sets that they have all the zombies at. Anyway, that truck driver who dropped Claire off in Raccoon City, well, he's been bitten by his dog who licked infected blood up at the start of the film, and he just crashes into Raccoon Police Department, like right at the front gates, and Leon just doesn't notice. He's vibing as a zombie walks in, burning. This shot is great. I will give you this, and I can't play the song because copyright reasons, but it's a very funny moment. Irons actually has to be the guy who saves Leon by shooting the zombie dead.
Goodbye, fucko.
Then he just leaves. He tries to leave the town like the corrupt coward he is, but consider this. Consider this for a second. What if the film was structured a little differently? What if we just started with Claire, with the truck driver, hitching a ride? They hit the zombie, dog licks it, dog bites driver, he gets infected. Claire goes off and does her own thing, and we cut to the driver driving through town, and he crashes his truck outside the police department where Leon is, just not expecting anything, and that's our film. We just focus in on that. These are scenes spread across a half hour that we could just have right next to each other in one tight sequence that gets you immediately caught up to speed with what's happening. Everything else can be shown to us more slowly. That way we dive right into the action and don't waste time with exposition that ultimately doesn't further the narrative or enhance anything. And we'd focus on just Claire and Leon, the two protagonists of our film. Wouldn't that be more interesting? I don't know. Might make for a good movie. Or a good video game from the 90s, who knows? Anyway, back to Resident Evil 1, which is now taking over the plot again. They find Bravo team all screwed up, and they all end up wandering to the Spencer Mansion, just outside of town. And this mansion is, again, lovingly created. The sets for this are beautiful. This sequence is a highlight of the film. But the cutting back and forth between the police department and the Spencer Mansion takes us out of it. We can't linger in these sets. We can't feel the claustrophobia and emptiness of wandering through the mansion, nor can we feel the tension of the zombies piling outside the police department, or Umbrella cracking down on Raccoon City. So Brian tries to leave and finds out that Umbrella is keeping people trapped inside of Raccoon City, all while Leon is stuck inside the police department. Makes sense. Again, this is where the movie amps it up. Things are starting to happen now, about 40 minutes in. Why couldn't we just start here? We don't learn anything in the first half of the film that we can't figure out for ourselves watching the characters act in motion here. It's a weird, I don't get it, how Irons has more development than Leon or Jill. And he has a better action set piece when he comes back to the police department and the dogs start to attack. Anyway, Claire saves Brian and Leon arrives looking like a dumbass trying to stop Claire, which is dumb. The abuse my poor boy Leon gets.
Leon, put that gun down. So are you in charge again?
The survivors at Raccoon City Police Department resolve they can escape Raccoon City via helicopter. Spoiler alert, they do not escape via helicopter. Meanwhile, Chris and the rest explore the mansion, and we get a perfect recreation of the iconic zombie encounter from the original Resident Evil. And it is here where you can see that everything before was just an excuse to get us here, to the isolated horrors of Resident Evil, and then they squander it. You see, the mansion does feel alive, and it makes me more annoyed we didn't just get a movie set here, where we can absorb and appreciate the beautiful sets made. Every single cut keeps your eye away from the sets. You can't take anything in, because they're cutting to the next sequence. They're so in a rush to skip to the next scene that you never feel the claustrophobia that the games excel at in this mansion. Outside the Spencer mansion, the helicopter gets destroyed, so that route's out. Almost immediately after being proposed, the characters kind of forget about it though, because even though the helicopter's destroyed, the characters don't know that, so they should still be trying to get to the helicopter. But then they don't. You'll see why. It's stupid. One thing the film does decently well is it does show how things are falling apart around the characters, how it kind of pins them down a little bit. The helicopter's destroyed. The helicopter crashes into the Spencer mansion. The gates for Raccoon City Police Department, they crash down. We see sequentially how things fall apart around our characters, and it pins them in a tighter and tighter space until they just get out. As Claire and Leon are getting the weapon set up, and Leon is just, again, being presented as a moron who doesn't know how to operate a gun.
I think it's sort of jammed.
We find out about Ben. You see, Claire learned about the infections going on in Raccoon City from a journalist named Ben, who's also in the games. He's investigating Umbrella, finds out about the T-virus and all that, and has important information that's meant to communicate to us, the audience, what's going on. And just like in the games, Brian Irons has trapped Ben in the basement. But we learned from Ben something interesting, that the police department is immune to the T-virus because Irons had given them an immunity to the virus. Frees Ben in time to have a zombie eat Ben, so we don't get much more information beyond that. But what's weird about this whole vaccination thing with the virus is that the police department was vaccinated, but not the Umbrella employees at the Spencer mansion. Yeah, it's weird, right? Because we see explicitly the zombies that are infected at the Spencer mansion are explicitly Umbrella employees, like in the game. So why would they introduce a vaccination for the police, but not the people dealing with the virus directly? Yeah, it makes sense in the games because there is no vaccine like that until Resident Evil 3, and that has a very limited quantity to it. But in Resident Evil 2, that's not really much of a factor, is it? So why does this make any sense? Leon needs to be saved by Claire when the zombies attack in the basement, and I'm not one that normally criticizes movies for infantilizing male characters. So when I say this, no, I'm not criticizing Claire, who is basically the main character of this film, and rightfully so. However, it does feel deeply insulting to lovingly adapt minor characters in the games like Ben or Brian Irons, but deliberately make the main playable character of Resident Evil 2 a useless buffoon, a burden. I get they want to set up an arc for Leon where he starts off at a low point and becomes a badass by the end, which they kinda do. And I get why they chose Leon, because putting Chris, Wesker, and Leon in the same movie, they're all too similar. One of them needs to stand apart. Leon needs to feel vulnerable as the rookie cop, while Chris is the established badass. I get that. But the problem is, you smash two very similar characters at the start of their journeys in the game series in the same movie. Leon and Chris only interact in the games after they've diversified his characters a little bit more. Chris becomes traumatized and isolated after multiple encounters with Wesker and Umbrella and Tricell. Leon's down bioweapons and those who exploit them. While meanwhile, Leon goes off to a Spanish village, saves the president's daughter, and then fights the president in the White House before motorcycling off the side of buildings like the world's biggest badass. They go in different directions. Chris becomes jaded and depressed and isolated, Leon becomes jaded and kind of awesome, but never loses that warmth and kindness in his character. These important aspects of the characters to showcase, and the fact that they go in the different directions they do is what makes them interesting. They become more interesting to have next to each other as they evolve as people. Unfortunately, though, in their starting point, they're both badass survivors fighting a zombie outbreak. They're very similar on the surface, until you dive into the more specific details. So I get on paper why they made Leon so much of a wimp. He's the rookie cop, he's the newcomer. But you didn't have to do that. The decision to adapt the first two games into one film is a dumb one. It also probably raised the film's budget. You know, single location horror is often a great way to reduce the cost of a film. You don't need to build multiple sets, you don't need to do anything like that. And we get these loving recreations of multiple Resident Evil locations that we spend seconds in. We can't take time to just appreciate where we are. We have to feel the isolation, the claustrophobia, the emptiness like we do in the games, wandering down empty hallways where there's nothing but the distant sound of groaning. But here we get nothing. It takes an hour for Leon to do something. Yeah, an hour, and he just kills one zombie. An hour into a movie that's 100 minutes long. We're basically just past the game's introduction, and we're over halfway through the film. Eventually, Wesker and Jill are led to discover the underground tunnel underneath the Spencer mansion. We learn that Wesker has been contacted by an organization investigating Umbrella, that being Ada Wong and her organization. We learn that he's using this as a ticket to get out of Raccoon City, which he sees as a dead end. And this makes Wesker far too likable. We get why he's doing it. He's not a selfish villain, he's a desperate person. And he really is more like Ada Wong than Wesker in this story, which is weird because Ada Wong's also in the story. It removes all the eugenics elements from Wesker, how he was raised to be a perfect soldier and employee of Umbrella, to embody Oswald Spencer's plans and plots to use the progenitor virus to advance humanity to the next level. He is no longer a cog in the greater machine of eugenics, he is just a guy. And as such, there's not much about him that makes him interesting as Wesker. He has a good character arc, sure, but it's not Wesker. At this point, the infected break into the RPD, and Ironside take the characters out of the police department through the back door. And, you know, Leon and Claire, they shoot up a bunch of infected on a confined hallway, and it should feel good, but we've spent so little time in the RPD because we keep cutting back and forth that it feels like a very toothless kind of chase. We're not going through familiar territories now corrupted by zombies, it's a generic hallway. It's very underwhelming. We don't really feel trapped either because we just get out of the building through the back door and end up by the orphanage. So it's like, why did we spend so much time in this police department if we're just gonna walk out the back door? You know, it feels kind of weird, doesn't it? Anyway, the Umbrella Orphanage, that's where Claire and Chris grew up, and apparently there's a passage from the orphanage into the Spencer mansion. It's the same passage that Wesker uncovered. That apparently is the nest. This hallway is the nest, essentially. There's some labs there. That's the nest from the games. Birkins does his experiments in the nest, and it's kind of reduced in terms of its value to the plot. In fact, by combining the nest with the Spencer mansion, it kind of reduces the value of both, right? Doesn't it? Because you don't get the underground tunnels. It explains why Lisa Trevor showed up in the orphanage, because it's like a big connected tunnelway, but like, that seems cheap, doesn't it? I think so anyway. I mean, I get it. It makes sense from a plot standpoint. Two evil labs in two different games. Combine them, mix them up. I get that. But like, the mansion is such an iconic location, and while the nest isn't not iconic, Raccoon City's the location that's iconic from Resident Evil 2, not the nest. Anyway, Irons gets eaten by a licker. I feel like he dies too quickly, and his betrayal is kind of glossed over. He was paid money by Umbrella to allow them to experiment in his city. I feel it should have more weight to it, but it's kind of glossed over. But the licker is then stopped by Lisa Trevor. Now, Lisa Trevor is one of the most tragic figures in Resident Evil history. She's experimented on by Birkin. She's treated as like a guinea pig for the progenitor virus and T virus, and eventually her immune response produces the G virus. Now, mixing Trevor with Birkin isn't a bad idea. It's actually one of the few connections I think is more interesting in this film. But her presence here raises questions that the film doesn't answer. Like, who is Trevor? I know we get the redacted documents on screen at one point, but it's not divulged to the audience enough to figure out who she is. We can assume, but unless you play the games, she's just a weirdo. And we don't really know much about her, beyond the fact she was experimented on. Also, Lisa Trevor is too nice. In the games, she is tragic, but still a threat, and that threat is partially what makes her fate so depressing. But here she's like the good guy zombie, essentially. Anyway, we now get a scene where Chris and Jill fight zombies in pitch black. This I guess supposed to be scary. It's not, because you don't see anything. It looks like we just ran out of film sets to shoot at, so we're shooting in the dark. It feels like a kind of hide the lack of sets we built. It's kind of sucks, but I digress. And it's here I realized that Chris and Jill have barely had a conversation. It's funny, in the original game, Chris and Jill, they're like the two protagonists, and they have a bond. It extends way past that first game. They both investigate Umbrella in separate situations in the following games. Jill showing back up in 3. In Resident Evil 5, Chris and Jill hunt down Oswald Spencer, only to encounter Wesker, who killed him first, and Wesker seemingly kills Jill. And that tragedy drives Chris's arc down into his more isolated, depressed manner. It turns out Jill's not dead, she's being mind controlled by Wesker, and that becomes motivation for Chris to act. They have this great story across multiple games, and in the films they barely talk because Jill barely talks. She's badass in a generic kind of way, but we never get anything beyond that. And that's a disappointment, maybe even more so than Leon. At least Leon gets an arc. Claire and Leon are now in Birkin's underground lab, the Nest, where we find footage of... hang on. Those are the Ashford twins from Code Veronica. What? What are they doing here? They're not relevant in Resident Evil 2. We find out that Claire was going to be experimented on by Birkin, but then she got away. Like Lisa Trevor and the Ashford twins, even though the twins in the game were genetic clones engineered and they do horrible stuff on their own and develop their own virus, the Veronica T virus, which is its whole other thing. Anyway, listen. I don't have time to fucking explain this whole thing. Just play Code Veronica. They all start meeting up at this point. Birkins gets the G virus while his family watches. Wesker tries to steal the virus at gunpoint. Wesker and Birkin shoot at each other, and Wesker ends up shooting Annette, Birkin's wife, while Sherry runs off. There's a recreation of the scene from the game where Birkins is shot up and then injects himself with the G virus. That's neat. Kind of shows what the plot's going to be at the very end, I suppose. And as opposed to Birkin wandering around town like this meandering monster, he's just a final boss for the end of the movie, I guess. Barely a presence. But anyway, Jill and Chris shoot Wesker, and Wesker reveals that Umbrella is going to destroy everything, and that the only way out is via a train. This is what I mean when I said the helicopter is no longer relevant. The characters all converge on each other, but once we learn about the train, that changes things. So they just go that way. I guess that's fair, I suppose, but it feels weird. They don't even mention the helicopter after that point. At least Leon and Claire, anyway. And I guess Wesker's an interesting character because he's tragic, and I guess Birkin is also the main villain of the film, so I guess you can have two villains like you do otherwise, but it just feels weird. Wesker is the villain of Resident Evil, and here he's like just too nice. The G-Virus mutates Birkin, and Chris and Jill, alongside with Sherry, they run off. And it seems weird because Claire and Leon are the ones who protect Sherry in the games, but now we're giving it to Chris and Jill. We're taking everything Leon does in the games and giving it to another character. That seems kind of weird, doesn't it? It's so bizarre. All of this falls flat, and again, Chris and Jill, you think, oh, maybe it's like a love triangle thing, like they're being pseudo-parents to this girl who's been lost, and Chris is an orphan, so therefore he can connect to a newly orphaned girl. No, none of it's ever brought up. It's not relevant. I'm actually putting more thought into it than the film does with this connection. And because it's so late in the game, Sherry doesn't even get another line of dialogue. She's basically mute from this point onward, and her role is basically a child who gets saved. Then Chris fights William Birkin, who's now infected with the G-Virus, and they have some dialogue back and forth that falls flat because their entire relationship is expositioned. We're told what their connection is, but we're not shown it. When Claire shoots Birkin, that's something, because there's some more connection there. But Chris is like being taunted by Birkin and all that, and none of it matters, because I don't give a shit. We're not shown any of it, so who cares? And all this ends in the finale from Resident Evil 2. They get on the train, they get away, Umbrella blows up Raccoon City and the Spencer Mansion, which doesn't destroy the train underneath all that, but just, kind of derails it a little bit. And Birkin, now fully mutated, attacks the train and attacks our heroes. And while Chris and Claire fight a little, it's Leon with the rocket launcher who just knocks Birkin down. And it's only here where Leon is slightly badass. But also Birkin is taken down way too easily. In fact, all the enemies are taken down way too easily. Every fight in this movie is just standing straight on, firing a gun straight ahead. There's no ducking, no weaving, no environmental damage. It's just shoot the bad guy with the gun and that's it. Anyway, we have an end credit scene where Wesker is captured by Ada Wong and he gets his iconic sunglasses and, yada, 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 whatever. The characters get away, they survive, movie ends. Very empty feeling end. There's no personal journey the characters go on. It's just get out of town. They got out of town. Okay. So what did we learn here, really? That mainly an adaptation needs more to it than just to shove names you recognize on screen. Like, yeah, sure, the stories of the games are here, but rather than tell stories involving these characters, we are told stories that guide us through familiar plot beats where the characters just kind of shoot the thing in front of them and move on to the next set. There's no journey, there's no adventure, there's no plot. It's just walk to this setting, go to this setting, zombie stops you from getting from point A to point B, move to point C. It's very generic. And this is most clear with the minor but vital details of the story. You know, Irons is a major character in the games. He's a major character in the story. And his betrayal to cover up the T-virus, to allow his city to be infected, to allow his officers to go into the meat grinder essentially with his knowledge, that's bad. You know, Ben the journalist, he's imprisoned by Irons to keep the story from spreading because Iron wants a cut of Umbrella's money. And he thinks that because of the role he plays, he can get away with all of it. That he can sell out his own city for his own personal safety. He's a deeply selfish, awful character, but he's kind of almost comic relief here. He's almost part of the gang. And his betrayal is glossed over as unimportant. He dies before he can even contend with the implications of his ethics. And his actions in the game are more monstrous than anything we see in the film. Here he helps out the characters by stopping zombies. He shows them a way out. He's not an antagonist, even though he acts like one. And there's inconsistencies too. Like, again, the Umbrella staff, they're infected because Umbrella doesn't give a shit about them. They're just disposable. And there's also the Queen Leech thing that possesses the memories of James Marcus, the co-founder of Umbrella. And so he spreads the mutagen with leeches, and that helps things out. And then Wesker's go in to cover up the incident and collect battle data on the T-Virus and Tyrant program. There's a whole bunch of nonsense that goes into all this that should be presented on screen. But it's glossed over because we want to see our familiar characters be badasses. And he gets strung along by A.O. Wong, apparently. The biggest issue, obviously, is that in an attempt to make the characters appear on screen, as they do in the games, they actually develop very little. Despite my complaints with Leon, he is the only character aside from Wesker who undergoes an arc. Everyone else is a badass at the start, they fight zombies to be badasses, and they leave town as badasses. They don't really grow substantially. The movie is pushing familiar set pieces, but we don't linger in those set pieces. And they feel weightless because it's not a human story and the action is boring! This is something original Resident Evil never forgot to include. Humanity. Vulnerability. Again, the action scene is just people standing in a bunch of hallways shooting guns straight at monsters, which is kind of lame. At least the Mila Jovovich ones have some set pieces that are at least distinct or interesting or visually cool, even if they're stupid and goofy as hell. I don't even necessarily agree with the direction New Resident Evil is going in. I don't know if it's a good idea to not have any of the characters show up in the movie, but by looking at the trailer, I know it's a more human story, focused on vulnerability, isolation. Zach Kreger is clearly making a raw horror movie. I don't know how it will go as an adaptation, I haven't seen it yet, but I hope that it is still feeling like Resident Evil. That it still is in this world, that includes connections that we as fans can recognize. But after this fan film, this theatrical, high-budget fan film, I am open for something that at least makes me feel the feeling I got when I played Resident Evil for the PlayStation 1 all those years ago. Walking down a hallway when infected dogs burst through the windows. The feeling of isolation every time a door opened because you didn't really know what was on the other side.